The US government has shut down again. And depending on when I post this podcast episode, that shutdown might be partial or hopefully it might even be over. I don't know yet, but what I do know is that if this shutdown is anything like the one in the fall of 2025, Americans and government employees could face significant disruptions. Last fall was the longest shutdown in US history, as you probably know. And that halted the work of over 500,000 federal employees, many of whom were actually forced to work without pay. And while the government does have the Employee Fair Treatment Act, which mandates that all furloughed federal workers receive retroactive pay after a shutdown ends, there was still growing anxiety at the time, like just a weird like anxiety in the air that these protections, that Fair Treatment Act, could be subject to change. Like so many things have been changing in the U.S. in the past year or more than that. So again, last year or fall 2025 left a lingering fear that has only fueled greater uncertainty and insecurity about the impact of future shutdowns and future changes, both for federal employees, more specially, and also for the services that millions of people rely on. And the problem is not just the temporary layoff of employees. Workers affected by the shutdown reported feeling vulnerable to the whims of a few, feeling like their years and even decades of loyal service simply does not guarantee them anything. This makes people start questioning their future while yearning for a more reliable and fulfilling career path and life blueprint. And this government shutdown is only one of many catalysts that have been creating wake up calls to mid career workers of the 21st century. Crises like pandemics, the fourth industrial revolution, mass layoffs, normalized burnout, also things like declining mental and physical health, the cost of living, global security threats, changes in social structures. There's just so many things that serve as, again, a catalyst for people to wake up and change something in their lives and or their environment. So welcome everybody to the Sabbatical Goddess Podcast. I am your host, the Sabbatical Goddess. My name is Lisette. Thank you so much for being here. So we're finally going to start our deep dive into sabbaticals, and I'm so glad we're finally starting our just our discussion on sabbaticals, what they are, what type of sabbaticals are there, why you would want to take a sabbatical, how to plan it, and all the amazing benefits that come with taking a sabbatical. I am a big believer in those types of extended leaves for professional workers. So, in this series, we're going to discuss, again, what sabbaticals are, as well as why and how humans have been taking sabbaticals for thousands of years. That's right, sabbaticals are an ancient practice, and it is possible for anyone to take a modern sabbatical. Um, you might be thinking, well, does that include me? Well, listen up and take some notes because it probably does include you and anyone, any working adult. So let me take a sip of my water here because I don't know how long this podcast is going to be, but we'll see. So let's get to it. Okay, so most people, when they hear the word sabbatical, they tend to think, oh, that's probably something that tenured professors do once in a while, right? And while many universities have a strong sabbatical program, it didn't start with them. And thankfully, it didn't end with them either. So let's see some definitions. Let's actually start with the Oxford Dictionary and see how the dictionaries define our term. So, according to the Oxford English Dictionary, a sabbatical is a period of leave granted to a worker, typically a university teacher or academic, for study, travel, traditionally every seventh year. And the term is rooted in the biblical concept of the Sabbath, a rest day. Okay, so that was the definition from the Oxford Dictionary, verbatim. So let's see another definition. Let's check out the Merriam Webster Dictionary, which defines sabbaticals as a leave or break, often paid, taken by someone such as a professor or employee for purposes like rest, travel, research, or writing, typically for a set period like once every 7 years. So those two definitions are similar, actually, more similar than I expected when I was doing my research, but they're not perfect definitions because they don't fully capture the complexity and richness of modern sabbaticals. It's just so much more than that. And like I said before, sabbaticals are not a 21st century invention, a buzzword, or whatever you want to call it. It's much more complex and interesting and important than that because it is an ancient practice. The term sabbatical originates from the Hebrew word Shabbat, meaning to rest, cease, or desist. It derives its etymology from the Jewish tradition, in which Shabbat represents the seventh day of rest, as described in the Old Testament and the Torah. Many of you probably know that the Old Testament in the Bible includes the Torah or includes the five main books of the Jews, also called the Pentateuch. So the concept of intentional rest and recuperation is, again, not a modern one. And the Bible actually makes very clear references to sabbaticals and this whole idea of rest and reset on the seventh day or the seventh year. So okay, so whether you believe in the Bible or not, I feel like putting a disclaimer here. Whether you believe in the Bible or not, let's treat it like a book that has. Right now, let's just see the references that the Bible has as a book on historical sabbaticals. So I want to check out some quotes from the Bible. So let's pull it up here. And the first one is going to be from the book of Genesis, verse 3, which says, God blessed the seventh day and made it holy, because on it God rested from all his work that he had done in creation. Okay, so this passage establishes the divine model of rest, the idea that even God rested on the seventh day or after creation, serving as a strong foundation for the Sabbath for the Jewish people. So again, that idea that if even God rested, then that must mean that rest is super important. Then we have Exodus 20 verses 8 through 10, which says, "Remember the Sabbath to keep it holy. 6 days you shall labor and do all your work, but the seventh day is a Sabbath to the Lord your God. On it you shall not do any work." This is actually also one of the Ten Commandments, which helped institutionalize or further institutionalize the weekly rest day into Jewish law, emphasizing reflection, worship, and rejuvenation. All of that fits under the sabbatical umbrella. Next, let's look at Leviticus 25, verse 4, which says, "But in the seventh year, the land is to have a year of Sabbath rest, a Sabbath to the Lord. Do not sow your fields or prune your vineyards." So this here is an important distinction, very important here. So take note. Because the sabbatical year is also called the Shemitah or actually the proper term for a sabbatical year, which is what modern sabbaticals are, right? They're not one day, they're 1 year, are actually called the Shemitah. And the Shemitah required farmers to let the land lay fallow, so let the land rest every 7 years. Um, and this was seen as an act of faith, as a strong act of faith, to let the land replenish itself while the farmer renewed their faith and trusted that God would continue to provide, right? So to be clear, here, the Jewish Sabbath refers to the rest and prayer day after a week of work, right? Saturday, while the Shemitah was the longer sabbatical year for rest of the agricultural land and the people working that land. The confusion here just comes from how language evolved, because we just used the root word of the Sabbath instead of the Shemitah to refer to what should be, again, the Shemitah, because of how language evolved from Hebrew to Greek to Latin, etc., etc. Okay, but that distinction is important and just a good etymology observation. So now let's look at, I actually have one more quote, a Torahic quote here from the Old Testament, which is from Deuteronomy 15, verses 1 and 2, which says, at the end of every 7 years, right? So now we see more references of the Shemitah, you shall grant a release, and this is the manner of the release. Every creditor shall release what he has lent to his neighbor. I love this and this reference, this passage here, because wouldn't it be great for everybody's debt to be forgiven every certain time? Wouldn't it be great for everybody to have like a clean, refreshed slate to just start again and do things hopefully a little bit better? That was the case for the Shemitah, for the Jews, at least a long time ago. I'm not sure if that still is observed strictly today. So those were all of the references. I believe those were the only ones I had. So let me just check real quick my notes. Okay, so moving on to the modern era. Some scholars argue that these practices reveal the holistic connectivity of ancient Jewish life, where agricultural cycles, economic fairness, and spiritual devotion were deeply intertwined, right? The concepts of the Sabbath and or the Shabbat and the Shemitah. However, there's still some debate nowadays on the exact length of these agricultural cycles. But together, these ideas of the seventh day of rest and the seventh year reset inspire the modern sabbatical. Now, aside from Judaism, there are other major religions that also embrace variations of sabbaticals in their traditions or their doctrines. Even though the specifics might differ, it's very interesting to see how the concept of rest is a sort of archetype where everybody that's human from anywhere, any corner in the world. I haven't researched sabbaticals in every culture of the world, but in general terms, or generally speaking, everybody has some sort of practice that allows for rest and reset. Every culture that I'm going to mention today, and just, I dare to say most cultures out there, because again, if you're human, you're not a machine. You need some sort of rest. Like we're a cycle of producing and resting, which is at least how it should be. And we're going to discuss that much more when we talk about the modern culture of work, right? But for now, let's look at some of these other traditions. Let's start with the earliest cousin of the Jews. Do you know who they are? The Christians. The Christians are a branch of the Jewish branch. So early Christians, many of whom were Jewish, by the way, because again, uh, the Christians stemmed from the Jews, um, and they started being called Christians after the term was invented, which was not right away. They observed These early Christians observed the Jewish Sabbath on a Saturday as their holy day. However, as Christianity spread among Gentiles and distinguished itself from Judaism, many communities began to recognize Sunday as the day of worship and reset. And that's for many reasons. We have that in the year 321, Common Era, Emperor Constantine issued an edict declaring Sunday as the venerable day of the sun instead of Saturday, as instead of Saturday like the Jews observed their day of rest. So this decree throughout the Roman Empire instructed that judges, urban residents, and workshops cease labor on Sundays, while agricultural work in rural areas was still permitted. So that's a clear difference between the Christians and the Jews back then. Then fast forward to the European Middle Ages. Monastic traditions influenced Christian practices surrounding sabbaticals. And this is so fascinating. This is really fascinating because I feel like during the height of monasticism, sabbaticals really gained importance in the Western civilization. Monks often adopted extended periods of rest or retreat for prayer, fasting, study, and pilgrimage. So they made sabbaticals something more systematic, solidifying it into the tradition. Pilgrimages to holy sites like Jerusalem, Santiago de Compostela, and Canterbury became popular sabbatical like practices among, again, these medieval Christians. And these breaks allowed greater devotion to God, mimicking the Jewish Mitzvah practices. So moving on, the concept of sabbaticals is rooted in religion, underpinned by religion, but it made its way to the modern life, and it was in a way molded by modern needs. And this we can see with the universities. So, universities and institutions of higher education, particularly Ivy League schools throughout the late 19th century and 20th century, uh, they started adopting sabbaticals. So, they quickly became associated with a 7-year cycle, mirroring the biblical tradition of the Sabbath year. And again, started implementing sabbaticals for their tenured professors. That is why so many people are just so familiarized with or they relate sabbaticals to higher education professors because it is a very old tradition for these type of institutions, much more than for other institutions or other type of professions. But we'll get there. One of or at least the most important university in the US to solidify the practice of sabbaticals and to bring it up in reputation and popularity was Harvard University, which was the first institution to formalize the concept of a type of sabbatical, which is the academic sabbaticals. And this happened in 1880. And what they did was institute a system of paid leave designed to allow their faculty members periodic breaks, usually after, again, the 7 years cycle, to focus on research, study, and professional development. So that's slightly different from praying and doing pilgrimage and meditating, etc. But it's still a type of rest and introspection and just focusing back into the self for the purposes of improving the self. So we're going to talk much more about the types of sabbaticals in probably the next episode, but either way in future episodes. So make sure you subscribe to make sure you have access to that information, that episode. Um, but yeah, those were I would dare to say the first type of modern sabbatical um, that is not necessarily religious is the academic type of sabbatical. So now let's look at another tradition, another culture, and see if we can find more points of convergence throughout different cultures. So, Islam. While Islam does not have a direct counterpart to the sabbatical concept, it emphasizes regular rest and renewal. One of the most direct counterparts of the Sabbath for Muslims is the Jummah, which is held every Friday. So the Jummah is like it's like the Sabbath for the Jews. Just the difference, or the one of the differences, is that for Muslims they pray on Fridays, right? So the Jummah happens on Fridays. So this serves as their weekly pause for communal worship and reflection. And then we have another concept that is maybe a little bit more similar to Shemitah because it's a little longer, which is the Ramadan. So Ramadan is a fasting period, which offers Muslims a month-long spiritual reset dedicated to prayer, self-discipline, and avoiding worldly distractions. However, Muslims are actually allowed to work during Ramadan. And most do work or just simply adjust their work schedule to accommodate for their demands of, the rigorous process of fasting for long hours. So, is the concept of sabbaticals limited to Abrahamic religions? And the answer is no. Let's look at some other major religious traditions, such as Hinduism. And the Hindus, they have something very interesting called the Vanaprastha stage in life, where around the age of 50, individuals withdraw from active household duties and the material world to focus on spiritual practices, meditation, and self discovery. And I'm generalizing quite a lot here. So let this be an invitation for you to do more of your own research. But by defining Vanaprastha, I don't mean to say that everybody, every Hindu, when they reach their 50th birthday, are going to go and leave everything and go on a retreat. This really depends, just like modern sabbaticals, it really depends on the circumstances of the individual. It might have been more common during the Vedic era, but nowadays it really depends on the circumstances of the individual, the demands of their life, and how they plan their period of rest. So that was Hinduism in a snapshot. Now let's talk about Buddhism and see if they have any similar concept to sabbaticals. Let's discuss the Buddhists a little bit because they have their own version of sabbaticals as a form of spiritual retreat, really, as simple as that. In Buddhist tradition, monks often take spiritual sabbaticals to engage in what they call vipassana. Okay, so first we saw Vanaprastha with the Hindus. Now we can see vipassana in the Buddhist tradition. So Buddhist monks might engage in vipassana meditation retreats or extended periods of isolation in monasteries for deep reflection and ascetic practice. These retreats are seen as a way to reconnect with the self and attain enlightenment for both the Buddhists and the Hindus. Okay, that I think was a very good review of some of the main religious traditions of the world. But let's look at some of the less or some of the less discussed cultural traditions. And let's first see the concept of the walkabout for Australian natives. So we can also see a similar practice of retreat and reconnection with the self and even with nature in the tradition of the walkabout for the native Australians. The walkabout refers to a spiritual and cultural journey undertaken by these tribes, particularly male members of the tribes, and it traditionally involves an individual leaving their community and traveling into the bush, traveling into the forest, into the wild for an extended period of time, often for weeks or even months, to reconnect with the land, their ancestral heritage, and spirit. So, this practice is deeply tied to the Aboriginal belief system, which emphasizes the connection between people and the land. And this is another common theme that we see throughout Native peoples all around the world, that connection between the land and the human, because the land nourishes the human. I absolutely love that. And while I was doing this research, I was laughing at myself because I thought um, it's very unlikely that someone during a modern sabbatical will just leave everything behind to go into the wild alone, right? We're so disconnected from Mother Nature, and we're just so disconnected from our our human animal survival nature because of technology. We just depend so much on technology. If you ask a child, for instance, hey, where do you think that watermelon you're eating came from? They will likely respond, well, it just came from the supermarket. What are you talking about? And you can even ask things like, where's your water coming from? And a lot of people wouldn't even know where their water comes from, the water that they're drinking, or the kids might say it comes from a water bottle. And that's just to say that we're just so disconnected from Mother Nature. And sabbaticals allow, or these extended periods of rest, however you call it, they allow the individual to realize how important it is to understand nature, how important it is to respect the agricultural land and the agricultural cycles, because we depend so much on it, yet we pretend in our modern, post-industrial life that we don't need nature, or that we're somehow superior to nature as a third person or as a third entity. That is why I just love sabbatical so much, because when you have that intentional extended period of rest, there is no going around it. You will definitely come to the realization that your body is not a robot, that we are dependent on our environment, and that it is important to take care of it and take care of ourselves as if we were a field crop ourselves. Our body are like a field crop that needs production and rest, production and rest. So I was just thinking about that when I was doing the research on the walkabouts and the native Australians, because it's just so important. It's just extremely important to come back to Gaia, to come back to land. Okay, so we have one more culture that I want to discuss, which is the sub-Saharan tribes. So sub-Saharan tribal societies also have cycles of rest and retreat, which are traditionally intertwined with, you want to take a guess, agricultural seasons. So again, we see more and more common themes throughout cultures that are very far apart from each other. They also have these sub-Saharan tribes also take their types of sabbatical after big transitions in life. So after big ceremonial transitions. And let me explain. So, for example, after the intense labor of planting or harvesting, communities might pause for feasting and for different rituals and festivals to celebrate their accomplishment and replenish their energy. This is very similar to to Samhain and to the autumn festivals. So similarly, again, back to the sub-Saharan tribes, they mark major transitions such as rites of passage, marriages, or initiation ceremonies, which they mark those life incidents or those life chapters with long periods of retreat and reflection, which is so beautiful because it allows the individual to heal, to recalibrate, and to prepare for their new roles within the tribe. And this feeds into what I was talking about the at the beginning of this episode about catalysts that often serve as a motivation, often as the only motivation that people wait for to take their sabbatical, right? Because unlike the Western civilization, sub-Saharan tribes know that after, or these or certain sub-Saharan tribe cultures know that after a major transition in life, you do need some time to just sit with it and adapt and transform according to that change in your life, instead of just waiting for the stress to consume you or for waiting for your body to um, to beg for that time of reset and recalibration. Okay, so we've talked a lot about um, the different cultures and the definitions and the particularities of each one of those cultures I mentioned. Now I want to summarize the points of convergence that we discuss, but I want to be very specific about what are these points of convergence. Okay, so the first theme is purposeful rest and renewal. This is pretty much a common denominator for all the cultures I've mentioned in this episode. That need for pausing your regular daily work is just present across the different cultures. Then the second theme is connection to nature. That's the second point of convergence that we see throughout all of this network of cultures. And so we saw that with the Jewish and African observation of agricultural cycles. We saw it with the Aboriginal Australian walkabouts. And yeah, that's just acknowledging, respecting, and reconnecting with the natural world during periods of rest, extended periods of rest and reflection of gratitude. The next common element is transition and growth. So, sabbatical practices frequently mark major life transitions. Like we discussed earlier, that can be good. Those can be good or bad life transitions. I remember for me, it was really, I would say, a bad type of transition, but a transition that I needed to go through. And that was that I needed to heal mentally and physically. I was having a lot of health issues that prevented me from working. Like I couldn't even sit or stand in front of my computer or at work for long hours and many other things. So that really motivated me to take my sabbatical. Ideally, I would have taken my sabbatical before all of that happened, but again, most of us need that type of wake up call. Okay, so that leads me into the last common theme, the last point of convergence or common denominator throughout different cultures, which is healing. Sabbaticals create space and time for healing, for the healing of yourself, of your body, the healing of your mind, and also the healing of the environment. Okay, so I think that after exploring all of this information, it's safe to finally define the modern sabbatical, because I think we haven't defined it yet. But I came up with this definition, which I think is better than what we saw earlier in the dictionaries. So, a sabbatical, as understood and practiced by the modern worker, is an extended intentional break from regular employment or professional duties, typically lasting 3 to 18 months, and granted or taken to allow rest, recovery, travel, and personal and professional development. It is often used as a way to combat burnout, promote well being, and rediscover creativity while also enabling individuals to reflect on their goals, acquire new skills, travel, or focus on personal projects. What do you think? I love that definition. I think it defines the whole concept, the whole umbrella concept of a modern sabbatical, and I just love it. I love it. One thing I do want to add before we conclude this episode is that sabbaticals are not vacations. So please do not confuse professional leave with vacations because they're not. Sabbaticals include rest and fun, but they're not limited to that. Okay, I think that is all the information that I have for you in this first episode of the Sabbatical Goddess Podcast. I hope you really enjoyed everything that we discussed here. Please leave me some comments on YouTube if you are watching this on YouTube. And yeah, just thank you so much for listening. And hopefully, I will see you for the rest of this series.